Yellow, orange, red. Colorful radio Luxembourg.
In the early 60s, many people discovered pop music on the radio, and one of them was Peter Murphy, better known to us as Peter Chicago. In those days, he didn't know that in 1970, his long career in radio would take a start.
It was exciting, it was pop music, it was something that we didn't have on the radio in the daytime in England. And that got me interested in radio. And I then discovered the shortwave band, and I used to listen on the shortwave band to some American radio stations. And gradually the interest in listening transferred to an interest in the technique of radio, and I became very interested in how radio stations worked, how a radio transmitter worked, and that gave me a technical interest. And in short, when Radio Caroline started in 1964, it had both elements. It had the music, which obviously at that time I enjoyed, and it also had the technology, the idea of a self-contained radio station on a boat.
This is Radio Caroline on 199, your all-day music station. Time now is 12:30, and you're listening to an hour of non-stop music. Right now it's Saturday Night Out with The Searchers.
And I very much wanted to work with Caroline in the 60s, but I was still too young really to be considered for work on the ship. I did actually go for an interview with Radio London, and I think I was very close to getting work on Radio London, but I think they decided at the time I was too young. And then when Radio Nordsee started up in 1970, it was like a golden opportunity. I was older then, I did have more experience, and I went over to Holland and saw Bollier and Meister at the Grand Hotel in Scheveningen, and that began my career in pirate radio. It was an opportunity to do something that had captured my imagination earlier in my life, when I was really too young to have been able to do it, and it was the opportunity to go back then and do something which I'd really wanted to take part in before.
Hier ist Radio Nordsee International mit seinem Testprogramm. Radio Nordsee International können Sie auf folgenden 3 Wellen empfangen. Auf der Mittelwelle 186 Meter gleich 1605 Kilohertz. Auf der Kurzwelle 49 Meter Europaband gleich 6,21 Megahertz und auf UKW gleich 102 Megahertz.
But Peter had some earlier experience on a land-based pirate station.
After Radio Caroline went off the air, there were a number of attempts to put radio stations on the air around London. Chris Carey, or Spangles Muldoon as we all called him at that time, he started up a radio station in London, and it was on the air, I think, from one day, and the aerial for the transmitter actually went across to a building that was used by the BBC. I don't think anybody realised at the time that this building did belong to the BBC. It was just a coincidence. But I got to know quite a few of the Caroline disc jockeys who had been working on Caroline when it closed down. Andy Archer, Spangles Muldoon. There was an American, Bud Ballou, who was over in England at the time, and Jason Wolfe, who was a disc jockey with Radio Caroline North. And because of my technical ability, they wanted to put a radio station on the air. I had the ability to do it, and we sort of worked together, and it was during that time that, as you say, I got caught and prosecuted for my involvement with it. And what it did do, it lost me my amateur radio license, because at that time I had an amateur radio license which was taken away as a result of my activities with land-based radio.
Sounds like fun, we're so happy at Radio Nordsee.
The Mebo 2 was a very impressive technical installation. I mean, it was a radio engineer's dream. There was a big 100 kilowatt medium wave transmitter. There were 2 shortwave transmitters and the VHF FM transmitter, and it was all very nicely installed. The studios were really a bit more disappointing because the turntables were very good quality EMT German-made turntables, but the mixer really in both studios, it was out of a discotheque. It wasn't really robust for radio use. It wasn't very good for radio. And the cartridge machines that we started with to play the commercials, they were really sort of amateur discotheque type machines, and to stop the machines at the end of playing a commercial, you had to stick on some silver stop tape, and it was an extremely cumbersome, awkward way to sort of program commercials. And so in many ways the station had spent a lot of money on parts of the installation, and they had spent insufficient money in other areas. But it was exciting and it was fun, and it was the opportunity, as I say, for me to do something which at the time I'd always longed to be able to do.
R.N.I. Number one.
I was actually out on Radio Nordsee on the Mebo when a news item came up on television telling us that the 2 Caroline ships were to be put up for public auction, and all of the English DJs on board were very excited. Of course, Caroline meant a lot more to us than it really did to the Dutch DJs who were on the ship. And when I came off the ship on leave, I was very interested to see what had happened to the ships, who had bought them, and I went over to Zaandam. As I say, I can't remember the dates now, it's a long time back, but it was the first opportunity. I contacted the harbour master in Amsterdam to ask him where the ship was, which is how I discovered that it was in Zaandam. And when I went to the ship, I met Gerard Van Dam, who presented himself as the man that had bought and owned the ship. And I was very interested because I had actually been on board the ships a few weeks before they'd been sold, and I'd looked at the transmitters, and I could see that really there was very little wrong with the transmitters on the Mi Amigo. In fact, on both ships, although the Caroline North ship had a lot more equipment, and there was a lot more damage to that ship than there had been to the Mi Amigo. So I knew that it was possible to put the radio station back on the air, and I was obviously excited about the idea of doing it. And in short, I discussed it with Gerard, and he was a bit guarded about what the plans were. He didn't give too much away, but he did invite me to come back. And it was a few weeks later that I met Ronan for the first time. Ronan was on board the ship, and to be perfectly honest, I didn't even recognize him immediately. But when I did, I discussed directly with Ronan the possibilities of putting it back on the air. And at that time, it was about 1972 or 3, I think, Ronan had become more interested in film and to some extent television, and he wasn't really that interested in putting the boat back on the air. Gerard, I think, had contacted Ronan and persuaded him to get involved in the project, and Ronan had been making a film at the time and saw the radio station being a good way to publicise the film, and in a way that's how it started. Ronan decided he could get publicity for the film, and I'd already told him it wouldn't cost too much money to get the ship back on the air, and the big question then was whether we'd actually be able to get permission to take the ship back out to sea again.
A new movie. Go is a movie about a new American dream.
It's a 3:15 here on Caroline, and my name is Norman Barrington Smythe, and I'll be bringing you music until 5 o'clock. As promised,
The big question to every Caroline fan up till today is what had happened to the equipment which was taken away in 1970 from the Mi Amigo and Federica by unknown persons.
Well, an awful lot of equipment had been taken off the boat. In fact, in 1970, and just after Radio Nordsee had closed down, Chris Carey, myself, Carl Mitchell, we were all in Holland, and we organised a raid on the ships in Amsterdam harbour. It was possible, it wasn't easy, but it was possible to get on board the ships, and we took quite a lot of equipment off the ships at that time. We took the studio mixers off, we took some of the Ampex tape recorders off, limiters. I mean, we did have plans, and we were quite seriously going to take the transmitters off one of the ships, because the idea was to try to get a ship back on the air. Radio Nordsee had closed down, and at the time it didn't look to us as if it would restart. Dominaton fleet had a ship which was later used for Radio Atlantis. We'd had discussions with him. All we really needed was the equipment, and the equipment was on the Caroline boats in Amsterdam Harbour. And as I say, we did take a lot of the studio equipment off the boat, and we had planned, and we were quite seriously I think we would have got the transmitters off if we had gone ahead, because the boats weren't very well secured, and all we needed to do was to get a boat in alongside, and that we weren't going to take everything, but we would have taken one of the 10 kilowatt transmitters, and it wouldn't have been a big job. It would have lifted straight out. So anyway, that's where the equipment was prior to the buying of the ships and the movement of the Mi Amigo to Zaandam. When we got the boat out to sea, Ronan wanted the boat to come across to the English coast. This was always his plan. Now, Gerard wanted the boat to stay off the Dutch coast. Obviously, he was a Dutchman. His interest was in Holland, but he also felt that the money, the potential for making money, was off the Dutch coast anyway. So there was a dispute between really Ronan and Gerard in terms of what they wanted to do. Gerard kept making excuses. A lot of work needed to be done before the boat could move to the English coast, and we were more or less ready to go back on the air, but we couldn't get anybody's permission to go back on the air, and Ronan wanted to wait until the ship was off England. We also needed to do work on the mast itself, because all the rigging was old, and we knew that a lot of the stays were rotten. In fact, some technicians did come out. They did change some of the stays, but they were lower stays on the mast. One day when Radio Veronica changed from 192 to 558, Radio Nordsee put a second transmitter on. We were sitting there just waiting for an opportunity to broadcast, and there seemed to be so much going on the medium wave band that day that we thought, this is our opportunity. There's going to be people tuning about on the medium wave band, tuning between 192 and the new Veronica wavelength of 558, and we switched on. We switched on without asking anybody's permission. And you tell me it was a Ray Conniff tape. I can't remember what we played, but we went on the air that day. We did stay on the air then until, unfortunately, as you say, the mast came down, because we hadn't been able to get the money and the opportunity to do the work on the rigging.
Good morning to you, and welcome to this test transmission here on 1187 kilohertz. If you'd like to send us a reception report, then we'd love to hear from you. Our address, P.O. Box 2448, The Hague in Holland. Once again, that's P.O. Box 2448, The Hague in Holland. And when you're writing in with a reception report, remember, what we want to know is, first of all, where you live, the time you're listening, and the strength of our signal. If you do all that, we'll love you.
Aan boord van het zendschip van Radio Caroline zijn moeilijkheden ontstaan. Van het schip is een aantal lichtfakkels afgeschoten. Er zou muiterij zijn uitgebroken. De kapitein heeft om assistentie gevraagd. Hij zou bang zijn dat een groep Engelsen naar het schip komt en dat er dan gevochten zou worden.
Out of the pipe. This is our last record for tonight, so on behalf of all of us here in the studio, that's R.N.I and Lee in Chicago and myself, it's good night and thanks for listening to us. And we hope you enjoyed the music we played for you tonight. We've tried to find some good stuff, and we hope you think it's strong.
A lot of those difficulties did stem from the basic disagreement between Gerard Van Dam, who saw the station as being a Dutch station, who felt rightly or wrongly that it was largely his effort that had got the ship back out to sea again, and Ronan's intentions, which always were to take the boat back off the English coast and run it as an English radio station. Now, Gerard came from The Hague, and he hired a lot of all of the crew, I think, that we had at that time. They were all loyal to Gerard, and really, when it came to a disagreement in terms of what the boat was going to do, Gerard had a crew that was basically loyal to him, and when we tried to obey, if you like, Ronan's instructions and operate the station as an English radio station, Gerard first of all tried to turn the English people off the boat, and there was a dispute at sea itself. That was a dispute which we settled on the boat, and it resulted in the Dutch crew leaving the boat and going off. And Ronan thought that he'd solved the problem, but of course the real problem was that there were a lot of Dutchmen on land who hadn't had any money, who felt that they'd been cheated, who regarded Gerard Van Dam anyway as being their boss and the person that was rightfully in charge. And they came back out to the boat again and took the boat over forcibly. And in fact, as you say, the whole episode did result in the ship being towed back into Zaandam harbour.
Sound of a Nation, Radio Caroline.
Yes, I can't remember all of the detail. I mean, so many events have happened over the years, but as you say, we weren't in Zaandam very long. We were lucky, really, because the authorities in Zaandam really didn't want the boat there. It was a bit of a nuisance to them when it came back in again, and we did have to pay some money to the crew before we got permission to leave, but we did sort that out quite quickly. And Steve England was, as you say, on the boat. And in fact, when Radio Mi Amigo started, Steve England worked quite closely with the Dutch station producing the jingle package for Radio Mi Amigo, because Steve England had always taken a big interest in jingles.
Sound of a Nation, Radio Caroline. Sound of a Nation, Radio Caroline. Chicago.
The 70s were the days of underground or hippie music, and lots of our disc jockeys really felt that the new Radio Caroline ought to be playing a different kind of a music to what most pop stations were playing at the time. And Radio Seagull really evolved from that. It was a radio station that prided itself on playing album music rather than top 40 single music, and Seagull really was part of Caroline's hippie phase, if you like.
Magnificent music too comes from Stevie Wonder, the one and only, off his brand new album Inner Visions, and a track called Too High. Try to feature some more of this album throughout the evening, and I hope you've had a very pleasant Sunday. We've certainly had a very relaxing one out here on Radio Seagull, 259 metres.
Particularly for our people listening in England at the moment, because I think most of the Dutch listeners will have heard about it on Journaal with Fred Emma tonight. And a letter from Kruidener from Katendrecht's Lagerdijk, 205A in Rotterdam. And just asks this question: what do we do if the government signs the Verdrag from Strasbourg? Well, one thing's pretty certain, that it's not likely to be in the next few months anyway, because the government did meet today in the first chamber, and they've decided to do nothing until the second chamber, which is the House of Commons, have discussed the situation of Veronica, because they have asked for time on Hilversum 3. So it looks as though we've got a bit more time here together. This one's by Colin Blunstone, especially for Mr. Kruidener from the Katendrecht's Lagerdijk. How about that? 205A in Rotterdam, 3020, not forgetting that.
The ship did start under its own power, but the engine on the Mi Amigo was never really big enough for the size of the ship. When it was first converted for radio, the length of the hull was increased by 7 metres, and the engine then was really too small for the size of boat. And certainly after it had been at sea a long time, it had a lot of weed and shells on the bottom. I think it took about an hour to make the first mile from its old anchorage, and it was just moving so slowly that although I think the hope had been that it would make the crossing under its own power, it was taken under tow, because it really would have taken weeks, I think, to have got across the other side of the sea. Really, at the time, when the Dutch brought the Marine Offences Law in, Ronan always argued and claimed that the Dutch would be likely to tow the boat in if it remained off the Dutch coast, because we had a Dutch radio station at the time, and of course the Dutch management really didn't want the ship to go off the English coast, because obviously this would be good for the English listeners, but it was almost certainly going to mean that the reception in Holland and Belgium was going to get worse. But I think experience has proved that Ronan was right. You know, the Dutch have towed ships in since then, and I do believe that if we hadn't moved the boat at the time that we did move it, that the Dutch would have towed it in more or less immediately after their own law had come in. And so, as I say, you know, it was a move to a part of the sea where we felt that we would be safe. In fact, you know, we have been safe up until quite recently.
After screaming out its love and music to a free and peaceful nation, we have overcome. The battle is over. Free radio becomes a way of life, but never taken for granted. For no man will ever forget Monday, August the 14th, 1967.
And this is Radio Caroline on 259 meters, medium wave.
Music's right here in your ear. It's Bob Noakes, he's very near on Caroline at 259 radio. That's really fine.
I wonder what Norman meant by including Elton John.
What really happened was that in the early days of the station, the English on board had a lot of enthusiasm for getting the ship fit for sea. We had a Dutch crew on the boat, and of course the crew were really just out there to do a job. I mean, they may have had some sort of interest in the radio side of it, but as far as they were concerned, they were just being paid to do a regular job, and they weren't particularly concerned to do more work than they had to. And there were tensions between the Dutch crew and the English, because we were working hard to sort the boat out, and I remember some evenings we would spend the whole night painting. All the disc jockeys would give a hand. Now the crew felt that we were making them look bad, because in fact we were doing more work, if you like, on the ship's maintenance than they were, and this always led to problems. They felt that we were disc jockeys or engineers, that we shouldn't have anything to do with the maintenance side of the boat, the painting of it, the looking after of the equipment. And we could see as well that there was an awful lot of money being spent supplying the ship and paying for this crew. And Chris Carey finally persuaded me that the best thing that we could do would be to take over the running of the ship ourselves, and that we could both do a better job, and that it would sort of once and for all solve this problem of tension. And the idea was it wasn't going to be a violent takeover, but there was a Dutch crew on the boat. Well, the Dutch crew knew that I'd been out on the boat in charge in the past, and I was going to go out to the boat to relieve the captain, who of course would have been happy to go home, because anybody that's been out on the boat for a week or two is always very happy at the opportunity to go home. They're not going to ask too many questions. So we were going to go out there with a tender from Scheveningen with a lot of provisions and a relief crew that would have been all British, and the Dutch crew would have gone back, and afterwards they would have discovered that then we were going to move the ship, because that was the plan. We were going to take the ship straight to the English coast. Now, if we'd done that, nothing really would have changed. The Dutch programs would have continued. The ship would have stayed on the air. It wasn't going to be any great upheaval in terms of what the radio station was doing, and nobody was going to be out of a job. I mean, Sylvain Tack was running, you know, the Dutch programs at the time. We had no intention of changing that. We needed that for the money. So it was really just going to be a change of regime on the boat itself. I think it might have been a very good thing, all concerned, had it worked, but in fact Andy Archer heard about these discussions, and when he went out to the boat he immediately put out a panic message on the air, And of course, once the secret was out, then that was the end of any such plan. I mean, there was a lot of panic on the boat, oh, we're going to be boarded, and but I mean, once the secret was out, the whole idea, as I say, was to go out there with a tender, relieve the captain and crew, and then move the boat. It was going to be a straightforward exercise, and nothing much would have been changed. But as I say, at the time, it created a lot of panic, and I think a lot of money was spent sending some big, heavy muscle men out to the boat to protect it against a violent takeover or whatever.
I'm a Fool for You. That's the title of the song. It's from 38 Special, from their latest album, which is currently bubbling under the Caroline Countdown. The album's called Special Delivery. Preceding that, the number 16 album in the Caroline Countdown from Bruce Springsteen, Darkness on the Edge of Town. And the track we had from that was called Badlands.
Get kitted out for the Caroline Roadshow. Caroline Roadshow t-shirts and sweatshirts are now available, featuring a design which includes the Caroline Bell. The t-shirts cost just £2.25, including postage and packing, and the super quality sweatshirts, which are available in all colours, cost only £5.25. So send today to T-shirt offer, BCN Box 1962, London, WC1.
What was starting to happen on the ship is that the hull itself had got very thin in places, and I can't quite remember when we started to have problems, but we started to get holes in the hull of the ship, in the plates on the ship's bottom. And the first time this happened, obviously we were pretty seriously concerned to actually have water coming in through the bottom of the boat, but we soon devised a technique for dealing with these problems, and soon it became almost a routine. We would create a wooden box between the ribs of the ship and around the area where the hole was, and then we would pour concrete into this wooden box. I mean, sometimes we would actually block the hole by putting a wedge of wood into the hole, and that could be sometimes very frightening because, rightly or wrongly, the thickness of the metal sometimes felt like a rusty tin can, and there was this horrible feeling that if you pushed the wedge in too violently, that you might suddenly open up a very big hole. So that was a very nasty feeling. And bearing in mind that this is right down underneath the plates of the ship, sometimes underneath a tank where you had to crawl into a narrow space, it really was frightening, because you knew that if suddenly the water came in large volume, you might well find yourself trapped in the narrow space and unable to get out quickly. I mean, I've had to go under the water tanks, but I made sure I had somebody holding my ankles ready to pull me back very quickly if anything went wrong.
Pirate radio ship Radio Caroline sunk early this morning, bringing to an end 16 years of illegal broadcasting, but the financial backers of the station say that they'll soon be on the air again.
Floating Awareness. 2 woorden die een paar jaar geleden een totaal nieuwe levenswijze inluiden. Een weg die leidde tot een kritische begeleiding van uzelf, waarin u uw slechte eigenschappen leerde onderscheiden van de goede. Die weg, die ligt nog steeds voor u open als u hem nog niet gevonden heeft. De mogelijkheid een gezondere relativering van uw mening aan te nemen, een betere communicatie op te bouwen en uw medemens meer liefdevol tegemoet te treden maken u geen beter wezen, maar wel een gelukkiger mens.
The end and the first decade in the career of Peter Chicago on board the radio ships. During this first period, he made some rare appearances on the stations. First, you're going to listen to a program from Radio North Sea International, and after that from Radio Caroline.
Iron Butterfly and In-A-Gadda Vida must be their best ever.
I love that one. Paul May likes that, actually. Because he was...
I think so.
Yeah, he played it one night and he was raving about it. I was very surprised, actually, because I didn't think that sort of thing was Paul's kind of music, but he was very much into it, you know. Mind you, I got a letter about him playing Come to Joe and the Fish.
I see Paul looking in outside the door.
Is he outside the door? Come on in, Paul. Come on in. He's being talked about, you see. That's why he's coming in. How are you?
Yes, Danny.
We're just in the Garda Vida.
Yeah.
I hope you played the long version and not the short
No, we
version.
played the
No, we
short
played the
version.
short one.
The long version's incredible.
Yeah, I know, but we want to get to the news.
Oh, okay. Well,
That was
carry
all.
on.
Hey, that's a nice camera.
You bet your
Bottom dollar. That's nice, that. I never see. How much did it cost you?
27 quid.
You're joking.
Yeah.
You must be mad.
Why?
27 quid for a camera.
Sure.
That is 7 8 56, 7
I don't know how much it is in
14.
dollars. I don't even-
I'm trying to work it out in guilders.
Yeah.
How much
I think
is
we're
that
going to
in
have our
guilders?
picture took in a minute.
What do you,
Say it's about 250 guilders, right?
that's right.
Do you realise that's 250 beers you're holding in your hand? Tony always thinks in beers. I have to translate everything into beers. And if it's not beers, it's 27. That's about 13 bottles of scotch. That's disgusting. Do you realise that? Who's reading the news? You, sir?
That's right.
Right.
Yes.
Well, we'd better go up to it, I suppose, in about 4 minutes. Look up and smile. Look up and smile. He's taking a picture from us. Oh, lovely. I like the way. What's that?
That's a flash going round.
Hey, that is it. Now, there's a little flash cube on top of this camera, and when he takes the picture, it goes round automatically.
That's right.
That's outrageous.
Fully automatic camera, that was. You see?
Could you get Mike Ross to build that into the desk?
I doubt very seriously. Ross would lose himself.
Yeah, probably. If Rossi's listening, and also Sheila, we're going to play a record for you, all right? No, we're not going to play Leap Up and Down. I got a nice one because I adore Joni Mitchell. I'm crazy about Joni Mitchell, and this is, in my way of thinking, her best song ever. The only time I've ever enjoyed ATV's The Engelbert Humperdinck Show was when she was on it, and I sat enraptured because she sang this. It's for free. Take us up to Terry Davis with the news.
However, the Aerospace Minister dismissed the calls as an organised campaign. Mr. Maxwell Joseph, head of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel Group, has claimed victory in his £400 million bid to take over Watney's Brewers. The final outcome is still to be checked, and the chairman of Watney's has not conceded defeat. And finally, Lord George Brown will appear in court on a drunken driving charge. The summons follows the accident which occurred last month, in which his Jaguar car was damaged. He will appear to answer the charge on the 7th of September. That's the latest look at the news, and now back to Tone and Chicago.
Thank you, Terry. Sorry, pity. Well, you better take go to Chicago. I can't say a word.
I'd like to say hello to two friends of mine, George and Diane of Mitcham in Surrey, if you're listening. Of course, I can't say hello if you're not. But I know you're great Moody Blues fans, and I am as well. In fact, I think all of us here are Moody Blues fans.
Definitely.
And from the LP to our children's children, I've chosen the first track on the first side, Higher and Higher. Moody Blues from the LP to our children's children, and that's Higher and Higher.
That's nice, that.
It's beautiful.
I love the whole of that album. There was somebody saying we haven't got a question of balance on board.
That's right.
We haven't got a question of balance.
How long have we not had a question of balance?
Since I first came here.
Good Lord. I'd never noticed, do you know that? I'd never noticed we didn't have a copy. Well, we'll have to get a copy of that.
Well, I brought my
So if
copy.
there's somebody, it's Decca, isn't it, that distribute Threshold?
Mhm.
There's somebody at Decca listening, perhaps you could get a copy out here to us.
Well, I tell you what, if there is somebody at Decca listening, down on the Albert embankment, although I doubt it very much if they're there at the moment, could they send us copies of everything? Because all ours, we play them so much, they're getting scratched. You know, I mean, they're just wearing out, really. I mean, particularly Days of Future Past, which gets played just about every night. We play Nights in White Satin. There's always a request for that, and we play it every night, and the blooming thing's going, it's dying on us, isn't it? You know, so if we can get to, otherwise when we're on land, we'll try and get it together. You know? See if we can get some out of the record companies. And you know what these record companies are like, you know?
Yeah.
Hey, listen, our #1 record this week is by...
Fortunately ended up in Cardiff, so I hope you're also fortunate. Jeff, and in case there is a Jeff listening and they're not too sure whether or not you're the same Jeff that wrote to me, this is of course Jeff from Bishop Stortford in Hertfordshire. And the next record I'm going to play is from Deep Purple in rock. And I'll play this one for you, Jeff. This is Child in Time. Deep Purple from the album Deep Purple in Rock, and that of course was Child in Time. The time here on Radio Caroline is just 1:30. It's 1:30, of course, in Central Europe, 12:30 in England. And Donovan now taking me back to the days of the Perfumed Garden, in fact a track I haven't heard in a long time. This is called Sand and Foam. That's Donovan, and a track from his album. This is Donovan, Sand and Foam, and I wonder how many other listeners with me heard that for the first time on John Peel's Perfumed Garden.
uw scheepsprofieltering en bevoorradingsproblemen heet J. Dekker. J. Dekker Shipstores en scheepsprofieltering. J. Dekker, Schoonbergerweg 15B in Rotterdam. Telefoon 010 76 8313. Bij geen gehoor 010 76 01 68. J. Dekker Shipstores. Voor een ideale proviantering en bevoorrading van uw boot.
That's Greg Allman and Midnight Rider. And that brings the time here on Caroline to just 21 minutes now before 2 o'clock. And I'm Chicago with you until 3. From 3 till 6, I believe, this morning, Miss Samantha Dubois. Well, of course, it would have to be 3 till 6. I was thinking of Peter Van Dyken, but of course he went off on the tender. This is David Bowie and a track from his album, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust. This is called Hang On To Yourself. That's David Bowie and a track from his album, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust, called Hang On To Yourself. I have another letter here, and this one's from a girl called Angelica, and she lives in Germany, West Germany, and trying to pronounce or even read the name of the town where she lives. It's Nibelungenstrasse. Well, if that's a district in Germany and you know it, well, that's where Angelica lives. My German pronunciation wouldn't be good if it was printed, and to read the written script is even more difficult. Anyway, Angelica's written me a very nice letter. She was listening to one of my programs, obviously, a few days ago, and apart from enjoying the music, she's also a bit of a DXer, shortwave listener. So, you know, it's a bit unusual to get a girl interested in that type of thing. So thank you very much for writing, Angelica, and we'll try and get a QSL card off to you as soon as possible, but not, I think, before I go off the ship, which will be next Tuesday. And this is Michel Polnareff, international music here on Radio Caroline, and this is a live performance of his famous song, Gloria. That's Michel Polnareff live, and quite a lady she is too. Gloria, and that was from the album Polna Revolution. Now to somebody that doesn't really need introducing, George Harrison, and from his All Things Must Pass album, this is Wah Wah. That's George Harrison from his album All Things Must Pass. Time here on Radio Caroline, just 7 minutes now before 2 o'clock.
20 power hits, 20 originele artiesten, 20 originele hits op 1 LP. Redbone, Susie Quattro, One Colony and the Shakers, BZM, Albert Hammond, Wizards, The Cats en vele anderen. Haal nu K-Towels 20 Power Hits. Slechts 17,50 bij je platenhandelijn. Ook op cassette en 8-track.
That's Linda Lewis and Sideways Shuffle, and that's in fact her new single. I'm going to play a track now from Procol Harum, and from an album entitled Super Starshine Volume 9, and it has a picture of the group on the front cover, and I see more kind of because my attention was drawn to it by two balloons emanating from the head, that one of the characters very much resembles Graham Gill, and the reason I recognised it immediately is because the comments are very typical of Graham, unfortunately not really suitable to repeat over the air, but if you're listening, Graham, you've been caricatured. This is Procol Harum and Homburg. That's Procol Harum and Homburg. Record that was, in fact, a pretty big hit, I think, over here in Holland, but wasn't really very much heard of in England. Getting all confused. The time here on Radio Caroline is now exactly 2 o'clock.
Radio Caroline.
Entitled Let There Be More Light, from the album Saucerful of Secrets, which to me anyway is the best album that they've ever produced, and almost good in its entirety, if you can sort that one out. And time here on Caroline now 6 minutes past 2 o'clock, which means just past the halfway mark in the programme, and I'll be with you for just under 1 hour. Then coming along at 3 o'clock, Miss Samantha Dubois, and she will be taking you through till 6. These are the Birds from the album Their Greatest Hits and 8 Miles High. The Birds, of course, and the track from their Greatest Hits album, 8 Miles High. This is Peter Sully's new single, released on MCA Records. This is called The World. That's Peter Sully and his new single on MCA Records, The World. And from The Who's new album, Quadrophenia. This is a track that just briefly heard whilst I was queuing it up, and seems to bear very little relation to the title, actually, but for what it's worth anyway, it's called Cut My Hair.
1,000 youths entered the Grand Hotel in pursuit of two leather-clad rockers. South Coast Police have warned that if the fight...
That's the track from The Who's album, Quadrophenia, and familiar voices in the background. The BBC Light Service. Oh, that was a long time ago. But the mystery of the title was explained in the first line, which probably everybody else noticed but me, when I was listening to the record originally. Anyway, Rod Stewart now, and from the album, Rod sings it again, is it? Can't see. But anyway, this is Reason to Believe.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth on 963 kilohertz medium wave. Europe's voice of loving awareness is Radio Caroline.
Just a few months after the Mi Amigo sank in the Thames estuary, plans were made to restart the station from a ship bought in Holland.
Well, we had plans to replace the Mi Amigo before it sank. In fact, one of the last meetings that Ronan and I went to with Sylvain Tack took place in Paris, and the purpose of the meeting was to discuss buying another ship to replace the Mi Amigo, because we all realized at that time that the Mi Amigo was an old ship. It had started to develop holes in the hull. The generators were at the end of their useful life. We all realized that the ship did have to be replaced, but unfortunately the meeting really degenerated into a discussion of money and finances, and it became more and more obvious that Sylvain Tack really didn't have the money to continue, and so that the plans to buy another ship were put on hold. But we had been looking at a ship, and it's quite possible that this was the same ship that Danny Feldstaker later sort of produced in photograph form. But as I say, that there had been plans at least a year before the ship went down to replace the ship.
Radio Caroline on 389 when my things get started.
Well, when I first went to Santander, we thought that the work would take about 3 months, and it was quite an exciting time because the shipyard was doing a lot of the work and things were progressing quite fast. But then the American backers really wanted to take total control of the project, and Ronan wouldn't agree to that, and the Americans withdrew their financial support and eventually started a legal action to gain custody of the boat. In Spanish law, you can claim that if by virtue of money that you have spent restoring a ship, you have made it into a valuable commercial item, you can actually claim ownership of it even though you never did own it and you've just spent money on its maintenance. And it was under that sort of basis that they were applying to the courts.
It's Caroline. It's great to be back. The Imagination Station, Caroline.
And really then it was a very depressing time because we knew that it was going to take a long time to go through the courts. We didn't know what the court decision would be at the end of it all. I mean, the courts could have decided that the Americans did in fact have rights to the ship, in which case we would have lost all sort of ownership and control of it. And more to the point, we didn't know where we were going to get the financial backing to clear the debts that we'd already got. And really, we had several meetings with different businessmen over the years, and quite a few people were interested and then lost interest, so it was all the time hoping and then being disappointed and hoping again. And then at the end it all happened very quickly. We found a Canadian that was willing to invest in the ship. The American action to claim the ship went to court, and it was decided in our favour, and they did have the right to appeal, which could have kept us there for probably another 3 years, and for some reason they didn't appeal. Well, in fact, it was as simple, really. They needed to pay their solicitors, and the solicitors wouldn't lodge the appeal until they got the money, and fortunately for us that never happened, and the appeal never went in. So it was a long wait, and all the time we were waiting we had no idea how long that wait was going to turn out to be, and then suddenly at the end it all came right, and it happened very quickly, and we left.
There was no jackpot winner in the lotto draw for Wednesday, December 25th. That prize money was added to the jackpot for next Saturday. 6 lucky people shared the second prize. Each won $58,925. There were 269 third prize winners, all $1,005 the richer. Saturday, December 28th, the jackpot was again not won, so it's still growing. The second prize was shared by 2 winners. Each received $331,901. Third prize went equally between 175 winners, each now $2,900 richer. You can join the winners. Enter Lotto 649 today.
You're listening to a test transmission from Radio Caroline on 319 meters, 963 kilohertz. Our programs commence at 12 noon today.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Radio Caroline on 319 meters, 963 kilohertz. I'm Tom, and for the next hour I'd like to take you on a couple of musical journeys through the past 2 decades. We're going to start with the Zombies and She's Not There, and follow that with the Yardbirds with Heart Full of Soul. Caroline on 319.
Caroline on 319 with Bruce Springsteen and Born to Run. We followed that with the long version of Style Council's Long Hot Summer. Some good advice from Stevie Winwood, While You See a Chance. We had Spandau Ballet with Communication, and Guilty of Love by Whitesnake. What can I say? A nice day. It's about 23 degrees out here. The sea isn't too bad, not unpleasant at the moment. And thank you very much indeed for all the people who came out to see us, and especially to Buster and Jean and Don and Teo, also Norbert and Chris and Keith and Paul, also John and Steve. Thanks for the champagne. All right, this is Caroline on 319.
Well, unfortunately, the one thing that is always a source of argument, dispute, everything else, is the so-called format of the radio station. I mean, a radio station in technical terms is quite simple. You have a radio transmitter, you have a studio, you have a mast. But when you get into the subject of programming the radio station, almost everybody that you speak to has got a different idea. And in the time that the station was off the air, various people had approached Ronan, and Ronan himself doesn't have a lot of strong ideas about radio programming, so he's always willing to listen to other people, to accept other people's advice. And I think that the way it came back was very disappointing, and I think most people probably feel the same way, but unfortunately, as I say, it was just one of these things that was decided during the time that the thing had been off, and you know, one of those great pities really, that everybody waited so long for something to happen, and when it did, it was a bit of an anticlimax.
24 hours a day and night, Caroline.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I really didn't know what to expect. I mean, the idea of putting such a tall mast on a ship was very much of an experiment anyway. Ronan believed that it was possible, and he never had any doubts that the thing was going to stay on the ship. But the shipyard themselves expressed the opinion that as soon as we got outside the harbour, that the thing was going to go over the side. I almost held my breath the first time a wave hit the ship and we rolled, and I thought, oh my gosh, is it going to hold? Well, after a while we got a little bit more confident, because we did go through some bad weather and the mast did stand up, but I was always afraid that we would lose it if we did take a severe battering. And quite honestly, rather than being surprised that it lasted such a short time, I really am. I'm pleased, but I was surprised that it lasted such a long time and that it did go through such bad weather.
And finally, on this day 1 year ago, Caroline listeners across Britain and Europe woke up to find silence on their radios. A silence which, for those living further away than the coast, lasted a period of some months. Weakened by the October hurricane and battered the night before by northeasterly gales, the ship's radio mast had come crashing down into the sea at about 3 a.m, putting the station off the air. Some said forever. Nigel Harris reports.
The 300-foot radio tower on board the Caroline ship Ross Revenge had stood for 6 years and was known by seafarers far and wide as one of the most spectacular sights off the southern English coast. For Caroline, the mast enabled high-power, reliable transmission on both 558 kHz, home of the 24-hour-a-day English language service, and on 819 kHz, where Dutch language and religious programming provided diversity of output and additional sources of income. The storm which hit the Ross Revenge a year ago was particularly savage, and at 3 a.m. it became clear that the forces of nature had proved the engineering feats of man to be transient, as must always be the case. No one was injured when the tower collapsed, although the ship became very unstable for a period and had to be reballasted. In addition, the mast, when falling, had destroyed vital and expensive equipment used to enable two separate signals to be fed through one aerial, and this could not be immediately replaced. Within 8 days, Caroline had resumed on 558 kHz only, with engineers having built a tiny temporary aerial, which put out just enough power to reach the Kent and Essex coastlines. Manned by a skeleton crew of just 4 people, the Ross Revenge survived through to Christmas and New Year 1988, with just a fraction of its original coverage area and audience. During January, the Caroline crew, working outside often in rough weather and sub-zero temperatures, managed to build 2 90-foot masts and complete a new temporary aerial system, which enabled power to increase and the coverage area to be extended as far as London and Holland. However, the ship's transmitters were not suited to low power operation, and technical breakdowns involving periods off air were common during the spring and early summer. In addition, it was not possible to operate any service on 819 kHz, as tests of a new design of carbon fibre transmitting mast failed in April. In July, the decision had to be made reluctantly to allow the Dutch language station to recommence operations by surrendering to them the 558 kHz frequency during the daytime, with Caroline then operating only in the evening and overnight. This style of operation lasted for several months, but enabled funds to become available for the purchase of equipment to enable 2 separate frequencies to be fed through the aerial once more. So, finally, at the beginning of this month, transmissions resumed on 819 kHz, with the Dutch moving to this frequency, where evening religious programming was once more able to resume. Caroline is now able to operate as a 24-hour English language music station, and the volume of mail being received indicates that the audience lost during the last year is quickly being regained. Plans for the future include modification of the aerial to enable higher power output, so that we can cover all of the southeast of England, Belgium and Holland. Exactly 1 year after the disaster which many people said would silence Caroline forever, she is alive and kicking and well on the road to recovery. Next year, Caroline celebrates 25 years on the air and looks forward to another quarter century of successful broadcasting. Back now to Steve.
Thank you, Nigel. The next news on Caroline is at 1.
You've been listening to Radio Caroline News, brought to you by Newsweek magazine.
Well, I remember quite clearly I was at home and listening to the ship when comments that some of the English DJs were making made it obvious that there was an official boat out there and that there was a problem.
Reputation. Finally, the British vessel Landward, reported in our 1 p.m. bulletin, is still in the vicinity of the Radio Caroline ship, the Ross Revenge. The boat is staffed by the Department of Trade and Industry. Negotiations between the 2 vessels had taken place. That's all for now. There'll be more news at 5.
On 558 kHz, this is Radio Caroline.
From international waters on 558 kHz, this is Radio Caroline.
Hello. Hello.
Ja, een hele goede morgen. We zijn er weer. We zijn gisteren met problemen van de generator zijn we eruit moeten gaan.
We zijn nu weer terug en ik hoop dat u blijft luisteren. Oké, ik ben hier tot 6:30 met Eddie People. Oké.
Well, that's my lot. I'm Ian Gates. I'll be back sometime over the weekend, I'm sure. Stay tuned for Tony Kirk. He'll take you till 9 o'clock with all your favourite music on Caroline 558. I leave you with a diva and warning. Bye-bye.
An opportunity to close the radio station down and to leave the ship, because if they didn't do so voluntarily, that official action was planned which would close the station down anyway. And it was suggested to them that if they surrendered and gave themselves up before the official action took place, that they would not be prosecuted or that nothing would happen to them, but that if they were foolish enough to stay there, then the consequences would be much more serious. So it was an exercise in intimidation. They were really threatened with unspecified serious consequences if they stayed on the air and if they stayed out on the ship. And I was very concerned about what I heard. The DTI were going to return the next day at 11 o'clock in the morning, and they wanted an answer from the crew as to what they planned to do and whether they were willing to leave the ship and to close the radio station down.
Some really fine music for a Saturday morning from Caroline 558. New single time now. Here's Jason Donovan, and he's saying every day, I love you more.
You set me free, Caroline 558.
On the dot at 6:30, let's have a look at the Caroline Saturday morning weather. Well, it will be a dry and sunny day with a top temperature of 23 degrees Celsius. The winds are southwesterly, the seas at the Falls Head are calm, and visibility is good. It's level 42. Good morning if you are just waking up to the world. It's Saturday, the 19th of August, 1989.
So I made up my mind to get out to the ship as soon as possible. Now I was lucky because the weather was calm, and at home I have a small rubber boat, and I used this boat to get out there that night. So I actually arrived on board the Ross at about 4, maybe 5 o'clock in the morning. And I had a talk with the DJs, the people out on the boat, and they told me in more detail what had happened. The DTI had come alongside. They had told the people on the boat that all of the people working on land were under arrest, that raids had been carried out in both Holland and England with people's premises being searched. People had been taken away for questioning. So the people out on the boat were told that all of the support structure had collapsed, that there was no more organisation or administration, that they were out at the sea on their own with no support whatsoever. All completely or mostly untrue. There had been raids in Holland and paperwork had been taken, but I mean nobody in England had received any official visitation, and as far as we were concerned, all of the support structure was still there. Anyway, we decided, well, we had no choice. We waited, and at 11 o'clock in the morning, the DTI did come back with the same boat that they'd come out with the day before.
Een hele goede morgen, het is 11 uur bij een rustige Noordzee. U krijgt de weersverwachting geldig tot middernacht. Vrij zonnig en droog en de middagtemperatuur in de hele Benelux ligt rond de 25 graden. De vooruitzichten voor het weekend, flinke periode met zon en op zondag helaas in de namiddag kans op een enkele regen- of onweersbui.
Radio 819, thuis op het werk of in de auto. Radio 819, dan weet je wat je krijgt.
André Haas is vandaag de dagartiest, ook al gisteren, maar toen moesten we de uitzendingen helaas wegens een ernstige technische storing eerder staken. Vandaag hebben we daar gelukkig geen last van die technische storing. Laten we hopen dat het ook niet meer komt en dat dit ook niet onze laatste ronde is. Hartelijk welkom, het is 6:06.
Radio 819.
Goodbye,
girl, and hello, listeners. 7 minutes after 11 on this Saturday morning. You're listening to Caroline 558. I'm Caroline Martin with you until 1 o'clock. And then at 1 o'clock, I think, is Chris Kennedy. Bon Jovi now from their New Jersey album. This is Lay Your Hands on Me. But every time the lightning speeds. This is Caroline 558 broadcasting live from the North Sea, going back to 1965 with 5 with the Four Tops. From the movie Saturday Night Fever, that was the Bee Gees and Night Fever. The film was good, but the book, it would have to be said, is a lot better. 21 minutes before midday, Norman Cook won't talk about it. Favourite song of Steve Conway's that one was, so we'll play that one for him, Paula Abdul and Straight Up. Are you going to come and say hello to Steve, Nigel?
Good morning, Steve. I trust you're very well.
I'm sure he is, having much fun where he is, and whatever he's doing, Glen Jericho now in Sugar Bog.
Well, they weren't expecting me to be on the boat, and they were surprised when I was there. And of course, I spoke to them and I said that we had no intention whatsoever of leaving the ship, and that that we were going to continue broadcasting, that as far as we were concerned nothing had changed. Well, they were a bit taken aback at that answer, and they said something about, well, in that case we will put phase 2 of the operation into effect. And they left at that point, and we could hear them talking to another boat on the radio, on the ship's radio, and we couldn't hear the other boat, and we couldn't really get much idea as to what was going on, but we were expecting something to happen.
Well, let's hope so. It's an afternoon for saying hello to people, isn't it? So we'll say hello to some more now. To John and Jenny Knight, thanks for your concern. Dave's going to say hello to you as well.
Hello from Dave.
Hello from Dave. This is the Beatles for you while my guitar gently weeps.
And probably half an hour or maybe an hour later, we saw a very big ship. It was the Volans. I didn't know what sort of ship it was. It looked like a big tugboat when I first saw it. And the visibility wasn't very good, so it sort of loomed out of a sea mist. And as soon as the boat started to approach us, as soon as I saw the name of the boat, I called them on the radio and asked them what their intentions were. And that they didn't answer on the radio at all. They completely ignored the calls that we made on the calling channel, which they're obliged to monitor. So there's no question they heard the call, but they didn't reply. And when it was obvious that they were, coming alongside, I called the British coastal radio station at North Foreland, and I reported that the ship was being threatened by a hostile foreign vessel, and called for assistance, and that call wasn't acknowledged either. Now again, the coastal authorities have to monitor these frequencies, so it's quite obvious that from the official point of view they wanted no communication on the radio, no discussion about what was going on.
This is a special announcement from the Radio Caroline ship Ross Revenge. At the moment we have a large Dutch tug, the Bolans, whose intentions are not clear, but which they seem to have the intention of taking this ship from the high seas. I'm speaking on behalf of the crew and the broadcasters on the vessel Ross Revenge. We've had previous warnings earlier on that some kind of action was contemplated. At the moment, on our starboard side, we have the Dutch tug, the Volans, which seems to have the intention of taking this ship, the Ross Revenge, from her mooring in the international waters at the South Falls Head. We'll try and let you know what's going on as the program continues, but I have an idea that events will move very quickly. Anybody hearing this broadcast perhaps could help us by telephoning the Coast Guard to register a complaint, possibly by contacting anybody in authority that you think could help us. This is the radio ship Ross Revenge, broadcasting from the international waters of the North Sea, and for the moment anyway, we'll return you to our regular programs. Thank you.
Well, the Volans did come alongside, and I went down on deck to speak to people on board, and they asked who was in charge of the boat, and I presented myself. They asked if the ship was registered, and I told them that yes, it was registered in Panama. They asked to see the ship's paperwork, but I refused to show it to them. At that point, one of the officials tried to come on board, and I physically restrained him. He tried again, and again I pushed him back. The third time he tried to come on board, and again I sort of pushed him back. And the next minute, somebody had hit me hard in the face, because I was actually knocked senseless for probably 5-10 seconds. I was knocked off my feet.
I'm interrupting this program to give you a message from the crew on board the vessel Ross Revenge. We're at anchor in the international waters of the North Sea. At the moment, there is a Dutch tug, the Volants, which is alongside. They seem to have the intention to take this vessel from the high seas. Anybody who is hearing this message, could they please try to summon some kind of assistance for the vessel? In the meantime, we continue with the program. Over.
Send me an angel. En zojuist op nummer 31 Warrant, and we are the Down Boys.
And when I actually recovered my senses, the boat had already been boarded by several armed officials, and they'd come on board and explained that their purpose was to remove the transmitting equipment. Now, I spoke to Mart Raumans, as I later discovered he was called, and he told me that they had specific instructions to remove the transmitters intact from the ship, to take the whole equipment in one piece. And he'd brought several technicians with him. They went down below and came back up again and reported that the job was impossible to do in one day, and that it was going to take...
Love is all you need. We've got Nigel Harris with us. Nigel.
Yes, we have been now boarded by the Dutch authorities. We are in desperate need of help, and they are to shut the station down and take us all off.
Right,
we are in international waters. This is a breach of this vessel's right to be here, and I desperately plead for help. We need help now.
So please, anybody who is listening, anybody who is in authority, anybody who thinks they can do anything at all, please help us. This is Radio Caroline, anchored in the international waters of the North Sea. We are currently being boarded. Well, the latest news we have on board the Ross Revenge is apparently, whether we can believe it or not, but according to our sources, this particular vessel, this Dutch vessel, this hostile Dutch vessel, is acting on behalf of the British government.
Please call your local MP, councillors, local radio stations and local newspapers. Anybody, please help, quick.
Thank you, Neil Gates. We've got just about, well, not quite everybody in the studio at the moment, but we've got a fine crew here.
And that it was going to take them something like 2 weeks to remove the equipment. I mean, they seem to have been expecting a radio transmitter the size of a suitcase that they could pick up and take away. And why they didn't understand how much equipment, I don't know, because they've seen pictures of the boat, presumably, but they really didn't know how much equipment there was, and because all the transmitter cabinets are welded into place inside the hull. The first thing they would have had to have done was use an oxyacetylene cutter or an angle grinder to remove metal. And so the technicians said, this is impossible, we can't remove the equipment intact. And then they got on the radio and they asked for further instructions. And basically they decided then to remove key parts from the radio transmitters, but they kept explaining and saying that they weren't going to do any damage, that they would take equipment and, you know, we could apply to the courts to get it back. But the whole thing degenerated into an act of vandalism and wrecking, because they did start by unscrewing things and removing things in a fairly sensible way, but as they got more frustrated and more worried about the time, they started to break things. They smashed insulators to get components out. Nothing that was removed was protected in any way. I mean, there were valuable glass capacitors, which are fragile anyway, just left around on the deck, and everything was lifted off our boat onto theirs in a great big net in a bundle with no protection for anything. They even took a hammer to the fuel pump on the generator and smashed the pump, and just breaking it and bending a great thick metal plate. So any pretense that this was some sort of organised exercise in just removing equipment that could later be replaced in a straightforward way, I mean, all pretense was abandoned as the day wore on. And what we found particularly kind of well, it's kind of created a bad impression with us down in the transmitter room where they'd been working, amidst all the wreckage of the cut wires, the broken insulators and what have you. There were just lots of empty beer bottles. I mean, they'd been down there drinking beer, and whether or not they'd been getting drunk or not, they had certainly been carrying out an official action and an official duty, and they were down there drinking at the time, and as far as we were concerned, it was just all completely inexcusable.
Dutch officials have raided a ship in the North Sea used by the pirate radio station Radio Caroline. They're being backed by British officials from the Department of Trade and Industry, who say there have been a number of complaints from legal radio stations in Europe that Radio Caroline is interfering with their transmission.
Well, I spent as much time as I could trying to persuade the technicians that were taking this equipment out that what they were doing was just morally wrong. I mean, they were all quite friendly on a personal basis, and they kept explaining, well, you know, we don't like doing this, we're doing it as carefully as we can. I just said to them, how can you possibly feel good about just smashing up valuable equipment and coming out here when you have no right to be here? And I think as the afternoon wore on, they began to get a little bit more sympathetic and ashamed of what they were doing, because at about 5 o'clock, one of them said to me, we are going now to have some food, and we will be back in about an hour. Now, to me, that was a clear message from this man saying, we are going away for an hour. You've got 1 hour to take as much stuff as you can and put it in a safe place before we come back again. And of course, that's exactly what we did. They had left a lot of the parts that they'd taken out of the transmitters lying on the floor of the transmitter room, and they hadn't finished a lot of the work that they were busy with. And in that 1 hour that they were away, we moved as much stuff as we could, and we put it under the plates in the engine room, and we put it on top of things, and we put it everywhere, and basically we just put as much stuff as we could in a safe place so that we knew we could get one of the radio transmitters back on the air again.
It's 18 hours, Greenwich Mean Time. This is News Desk in the BBC World Service. John Wing with the news. Dutch officials have boarded the pirate radio ship Radio Caroline, which is anchored in the North Sea off the Kent coast. The move follows complaints from broadcasting stations in Europe that Caroline's transmissions were interfering with their own services. The Dutch operation was supported by the British Department of Trade and Industry, which had been watching the ship for some time. A spokesman said Radio Caroline, which specializes in pop music, has been broadcasting illegally under international law. But the station says it's in international waters and outside British and Dutch jurisdiction.